Hello everybody. This is a featured emotion that we did for autumn 2018. Obviously we didn't have a featured emotion, not usually in the spring. We usually do these for the fall because I have some prep time, and this was one of my choice. Students didn't choose it, but I thought it important given the changes we saw in the world in 2018, and you know, the whole electoral process and what we saw manifesting itself. So the featured emotion then was hatred, hate, and we'll go through, we'll look at definitions, we'll look at how people have theorized this, we'll look at a little empirical research, kind of the whole package on hate. I just finished videotaping for you guys the one on hope, so, but obviously it came after this one. That was just the order I wanted to tape them, because I needed some hope to get through hate. Strange as that may sound. Okay. Notice I'm talking hatred. All the cats have left me. There's no kittens. They're all back asleep. I don't think they want to listen to this. And if you don't want to listen to it, you don't have to either. Right? So let's talk about this. This is a short lecturette. There's 11 slides, so counting the title and the end slides, there's only 9. We'll move through it relatively quickly. Classic definitions of hate. Let's revisit some of the people we've been talking about. In fact, we've talked about all 5 of these in the context of this class. So Descartes, awareness of an object is bad and an urge to withdraw from it. Right? So right off the bat, we get the idea from Descartes that hate is an avoidant phenomenon. And I'm not willing to necessarily call hate an emotion. Let's get at that here in the next slide. But definitions first. Spinoza. Pain resulting from sadness attributable to external cause, right? And we know what was Spinoza's big deal that generated emotions. And remember, when we're talking Spinoza, it's important to think in terms of power, right? And joy is the increase in power, and sadness is the loss of power. We could see where hatred then for Spinoza might come out of the removal of power, and we might hate the target that has done that to us. And we can see that manifest itself in countries across the world historically. Aristotle, no pain, incurable over time, a desire to the annihilation of the object or the source. Right? And we can see annihilation and hate are certainly cousins in the manifestation of hate. Hume, undefinable because it's irreducible feelings from immediate sensory impressions. So that's where Hume gets us, and I don't know that that's all that useful if we're trying to define, but that's Hume for us. And then Darwin, a special feeling that lacks facial expressions and manifests itself in rage. And Darwin speaking like the true, you know, kind of biological, emotional theorist. You know, that makes sense. It's a special feeling in that it lacks facial expressions, and remember Darwin is about facial expressions and the evolution of emotions. So hate is a syndrome, and I want to pitch this idea here. A syndrome then is the multi-component notion. If an emotion can be construed as multi-component response tendencies that unfold over relatively short time spans, so hatred is something that is generated through multiple components and can occur over a relatively short time, then hate may well be construed as a syndrome. And I will offer then, if hate can be construed as a syndrome, then could we construe love in such a way as a syndrome as well? And remember, I've asked this question in class. We can return to this question: is love an emotion? And that's fodder for quite a bit of debate and exploration of the ideas, right? So then hate, if it's construed as a syndrome, both episodic and dispositional elements are required for hate to be cultivated. And again, this is kind of that syndromatic concept here, that hate is not something that is an experience to a stimulus, a simple straight up experience to a stimulus, like getting hit and becoming angry, or smelling something horrible and becoming disgusted, that there's more to it than that, and more is involved, right? Ekman describes hate as an emotional attitude, And so now all the ideas that we have about attitudes as behavior, cognition, emotion, right, and the evaluation of valence, negative or positive, right, is a relatively complex process. So Ekman is going to go there as an emotional attitude that derives from a greater. And notice that Ekman didn't make a case for hate as one of his universal facial expressions. It can be motivated, it can be assembled from anger, contempt, injustice, power, distance, resentment, fear. So we can see that it's multifaceted. It's the antecedents to hate are usually not a single antecedent, but multiple antecedents that are processed over time. One thing I think we can say for sure is hate is supported by and created by narrative, and not an unfamiliar concept for us in this class at this point. Let's look at Galen on hate. Hatred is a neurotic attachment to a self-created enemy that's designed to rationalize anxiety and torment of a demeaning existence. And that's a pretty powerful statement. And again, it points us towards a syndrome. It's you know, when people, especially in our current political climate, you know, one of the famous statements that's cliche now is going to own the libs, right? That people are behaving in a certain way towards an enemy on the basis of that enemy's action, and it's on the basis of this narrative, right? And people do become attached to this narrative. When I was studying the white supremacists on Stormfront, etc., and the white supremacists, we saw the importance of narrative, and we see that people are attached to this and they can't let it go. Is it a neurotic attachment? I don't know how you want to define that, but it's an attachment that they seem to be unwilling to shed, and it seems to be an attachment that people are unwilling to question. So if you get neurotic attachment out of those components, then we're probably good to go with Galen's statement, right? It's been designed to rationalize the anxiety and torment. And again, we often see hatred towards a group of people who seem to be moving up the ladder, that seem to be developing a leg up. So if I hear the statistics that by 2050 the majority of people in the United States will be of Hispanic origin, then, and I don't want that to happen, and I fear that happening, and the potential for that makes me anxious, then we can see how I might then turn to hating these people, and because it will demean my existence. My belief in the superiority of my ethnicity will be threatened by this ever-increasing number of people of a different type, right? So contributing states to this is a sense of powerlessness. Wow, the country is changing its complexion and there's nothing I can do about it. Anger and fear, and we know that relationship. I see anger and fear as relatively inseparable. I've made that argument to you in previous discussions, that I become angry at people who make me afraid, essentially. So it's that, and we have biological support like the HPA axis that we described earlier. Perhaps it's humiliation, and people feel that, in fact, a dominant group is humiliating them in some fashion. Or not a dominant group, not necessarily a majority, it can be a dominant minority. And the Jews were seen as humiliating the Germans in the 1920s as we left Treaty of Versailles. And then maybe trapped or inhibited. And we see a lot of people use the term politically correct. And they get angry because they can no longer say things that they feel they're entitled to say at the workplace, because we have to be politically correct. And we use political correctness as this term that demonstrates that I'm being somehow muzzled or not allowed to say these things. And I'll counter with this, that political correctness might be construed from a different point of view, as if I am complaining about being politically correct. Really, politically correct is just saying, be kind to others. Don't say these things that might offend other people. And a basic approach of kindness is, wow, you don't like to be referred to that way? Well, you know what, I'm going to be kind and I'm not going to refer to you that way. Is that being politically correct, or is it being kind? And notice those terms have a tremendous amount of overlap. If we're complaining about being politically correct, it might be instructive to step back and saying, is my being politically incorrect also being unkind? And if I'm being unkind, then why do I want to be unkind? Or why am I entitled to be unkind? And I think those become interesting issues. And also the experience of being trapped. The things are changing, right? And oftentimes people see their neighborhood change. And they can't afford to move out. And now they feel trapped by these outsiders who are coming in to the country. Here in Columbus, you hear some people complain about the Somali population taking over neighborhoods, right? And now I can't leave the neighborhood and I feel trapped by these people who are different than I am. So all of these can be kind of contributing states to hatred, at least kind of facilitate movement into the experience of hatred towards other groups. So the 4 features: perception of negative or positive love essence is one of the features of hate. And that's usually in turn, sometimes loving my own, hating the outgroup, right? The negative, positive evaluations linked to moral judgment. This is the right thing to do. That is the wrong thing to do. Exclusion of possibility of compassion or ill-wishing. Extremities seems to be a feature of hatred, and may be endorsed by an actor to a later or lesser extent. That is, the intensity varies in hatred. Identity as hater varies, and what that means, how it's defined. The level of preoccupation, is it a neurotic preoccupation, as Galen was suggesting, right? And reaction to one's hatred is positive or negative, or justified or unjustified, right? And we tell stories, we develop narratives that justify hatred towards another group. Right? So the in-group will go to great lengths to justify their hatred and cultivate that hatred towards the out-group. And they'll supply what sound like extremely rational reasons for that hatred. So if we look then at the cognitive interpersonal cycle, then the automatic thoughts, right, are the result of beliefs and assumptions, and this is generated by the narratives via our culture. External events that occur can support this. And notice that often external events are perceived in such a way to support this, but the external events could be in fact perceived in other ways. But notice that hatred tends to limit the flexibility of perception, and it becomes narrower and narrower. Hey Penelope, how are you doing? And then bias perception and recall. So if I observe a big ambiguous behavior, I can interpret that behavior as supporting my hatred, supporting the narrative. And I also then tend to recall, my memory is affected by these components, and I tend to recall things that will support my idea. Now we know that Ekman talked about mood, so the automatic thoughts can generate mood, and that's kind of a trippy way to think of it, because remember, we've defined mood as something where the source isn't necessarily obvious to us. And automatic thoughts, wow, non-conscious experience, then can be a great explanation for mood generation in that regard. And the mood then affects our recall, as we've seen as well. So now the automatic thoughts, right, then generate interpersonal behavior, and we've talked about body language, and we've talked about word choice in this class so far. So we see that a lot of those body language, especially is non-consciously generated. That's those automatic thoughts, right? And the interpersonal behavior is then going to affect the response of others. And it's kind of, this sequence is somewhat akin to a self-fulfilling prophecy. Boy, I have automatic negative thoughts, which then cause me to demonstrate body language or avoidance behaviors, right? Which then generates similar behaviors in the others, the response of others, which then justify my automatic thoughts. So we can see, and this of course is from Jessica Zhao for Sternberg. Jessica was a student in one of the previous iterations, and she had missed the extra credit opportunity and wanted to do something else, so I put her to work developing these. Right? So that's her credit as well. So the sequence of events in an episode of marital violence, let's take an example. What do we see? Well, we see that the wife might be critical, right? And then the interpretation of her criticism is, oh my gosh, she thinks I'm a nobody, right? And then the distressed feeling, that is the emotional response here, is feeling belittled, weak, or hurt, right? And then, but Now the action, he hits her as response. She deserves it. That's the permission giving. Hey, I'm justified in doing this, people, because, you know, that's what they deserve, right? And the anger and the urge to punish her, right? So, but notice that the victimization. So as we move through here, the wife's critical, thinks nobody, victimization, anger is generated, she deserves it, is the permission giving, and then he hits her. So we can see how these all work together. And the narrative is what supports this. So a larger narrative can tell the story of how this worked towards a group of people, how it became justified, and these public displays of aggression often reinforce the narrative. Now, Aaron Beck, Prisoners of Hate, the book that this was drawn from. Aaron Beck, what do we, anyone, Aaron Beck, what might be, what are some of Aaron Beck's greatest contributions? Anyone? The BDI, what is that? The Beck Depression Inventory. Remember, Beck, as a clinician, studied clinical depression and developed the Beck Depression Inventory. He looked at the cognitive components of depression, right? And let's look then at the cognitive components, because he wrote this great book called Prisoners of Hate. That's another book I recommend heartily by Dr. Beck. So the factor, image of self, blameless or victim. This is a blameless victim, oh my God. Reactive offender victim, persecutors victim, aggressive nations view themselves as victim. Image of victim, the victimizer, right? Victimizer, 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 right? So they view themselves as the victim. This is one of the key components to hate, and the image of the victim then is actually the victimizer. So they're able to turn this around and talk in terms of being a victim. So we've seen some recent repetitive press conferences where someone in a level of tremendous power continues to refer to themselves as victims. Or we see white supremacists refer to themselves as victims. We saw the Nazis refer to themselves as victims of the Treaty of Versailles. They referred to themselves as victims of the Treaty of Versailles, victims of the Jews, victims of the French in retaliation. Having forgotten that the Austrians and the Germans were the ones that frickin' started the war. They were not the victims, they were in fact the victimizers. But we see in hatred that the victimizer often becomes the victim, right? The orientation is egocentric. It can be blown up to group egocentrism, right, or egotism. Attitude towards violence, it's permissive, it's permitted, right? It's permitted. And the thinking is dualistic in that we can see ourselves as a victim in this role. So this is kind of Beck's analysis of the different levels of cognition. So the four roots of violence that we might see: instrumental pragmatic concerns to get one's way. So I might engage in violence simply to acquire a resource to put someone in their place. It might be restoring, maintaining image, pride, to maintain self-esteem, etc. So this is when we want to get busy to reinstill. And notice how this worked for Germany and how it worked for the Nazis. It became a martial society. War became a way, and military strength became a way to demonstrate one's prowess and build up one's self-esteem. It can be idealism, to achieve a desired vision or end state. And again, Nazi Germany, they said we need a world that's free of Jews, right? And that then permitted them to exterminate the Jews. Sadism is thought to be probably the least explanatory, but within any group of aggressors, you're likely to find a small proportion, as some subset of people, who simply get off on harming others, and that would be a sadism explanation, but it's not the ultimate explanation. So let's look at Irvin Staub here and the prescription for correcting hate, because I think it's important that when we talk about hate, let's talk about the hope of eliminating hate rather than the despair in being overrun by hate. We can go through the process of healing. That is, heal the harm and the wounds that we feel, right? Reconciliation, that is, come to each other and discuss and appeal to each other's compassion. Deep contact, that is, we have to engage in strong contact with others. Develop and work for shared goals in joint projects. So expand the notion of community and what we can do to create community. You got to go back and you got to understand the roots of the violence and the hostility, and you have to, that's where part of the reconciliation comes in. How did we get here? Let us explain how we got to this point, and then once we understand that, then we begin to create a shared history that's acceptable to all. How did we get here? Well, this happened, and you know what? This was our role in it, this was your role in it, and we come, and that's that conciliatory approach to developing a new narrative, a shared history that supports us moving forward without hate. Right? And then the humanization of all, that none of us are subhuman, none of us are better than each other, and that we're willing to work under that premise. You can find more about this at the Psychology of Peace and Violence program, and there's a website for you at the University of Massachusetts. That's about all I got to say on hatred. Again, I think what's core component example in here, though, as much as anything, is how hatred is supported by a narrative. It can be multifaceted, and we introduce the term syndrome as something that represents probably, if we look at maybe, I don't know if you want to array them this way, but we maybe have affect, and then we have emotion, right? Basic emotion. We have maybe complex or combined emotions, and then perhaps syndromes, if we want to start arraying this on some kind of continuum. But let's not get too tied up with that. Let's just kind of consider it that way. And another way to eliminate hatred then is to that close contact, and I don't know how you get any closer than that. So Alice and Pigpen and Digby, wish you all the best. I hope you all are safe, healthy, and happy. And that's it for this one.